going to talk first a bit about research and development and how that has shifted and how that could shift in the future, and the employment of scientists and engineers within that. And I'm then going to finish off by making some general comments about things that I think we haven't yet covered that we've done work on that might be relevant to the discussion around arms conversion in the wider economy. So starting with research and development, it's one of these things that if you dig into the figures, you'll see that government spending on military research and development since the mid-80s and then the fall of the Cold War has fallen about 70% up until this last Tory government came in. And at that time, about 2011, it fell to £1.4 billion. So that's a massive fall. And if you look at the civilian science and technology spending, that funded by government over the same period, although it wobbles a lot, by around 2011, virtually all of that money, an equivalent amount of money, is spent in civilian research and development areas. So you could argue that we had a large amount of arms conversion over that 20-year period. That we went from a situation where you had somewhere in the region of £4.5 billion pounds spent on military R&D down to less than 1.5, and that money was shifted into the civilian arena. And I've not managed to find any jobs figures related to this, but based on a sort of crude estimate, making a few economic assumptions, that somewhere in the region of 50 to 100,000 jobs that have kind of switched over that period, which I think is really significant and, again, not widely acknowledged, not widely discussed. Some of those jobs will probably be in areas close to military R&D, so it's things like the security sector, border control, surveillance, some of the other really dodgy stuff. But there are a lot of other areas that are much more socially valuable, and renewable energy and environmental issues will be some of those areas where there has been expansion in funding and growth in jobs. So that's one aspect of it. Where we've gone since Conservatives have been in power since, we've started to see military research and development spending start to climb again. And whilst civilian research and development spending has been flat through austerity, so there's been austerity for civilian research and development, but no austerity for military research and development. In fact, completely the opposite. Where we're heading, I was going to be quite pessimistic until this week, and I'm still not sure whether to be pessimistic or optimistic about where we're heading now. In the autumn statement just this week, they've talked about raising the civilian research and development spending by £2 billion worth a year by 2020. So there's a lot more research and development spending that is planned by this government. What it will be spent on is one of these things for debate. On the positive side, there is at least talk of electric cars and a big expansion in that sector. There's also talk of a lot of military technologies, particularly things like autonomous robotics, artificial intelligence, these sorts of areas which are particularly of interest to the military. So that's kind of where things are sort of shifting. Obviously, green technologies have been part of this transition, and universities have been part of this transition, but there's still a situation where we've still got a large chunk of military R&D spending, and Britain, within the OECD countries, the sort of industrialised democracies, Britain is second only to the USA in terms of the proportion of its research and development that's spent on military objectives. But nevertheless, there's been a large shift and growth in certain areas. So that's the sort of science and technology research side of things. A few observations about the wider economy. Firstly, the sort of jobs issue around arms conversion and how many jobs have been in the sector. If you look at Ministry of Defence figures for employment in the military-industrial sector, from the Cold War until 2010, you'll see there was a drop of about 250,000 in the number of jobs in that sector. So there's a huge contraction in the number of people working in that sector. Over the same period, we saw the renewable energy industry in the UK go from virtually zero to about 100,000. And these are either government or industry figures that I'm using here. So you have seen, on the UK economy side, arms conversion of sorts. Had 250,000 jobs lost in the military-industrial sector. You've had a growth in a number of other industrial sectors. One of them's been renewables, and that one has taken up nearly half of the shrinkage. So there has been arms conversion. And then you've got potential for future arms conversion, and there are the various reports like which Molly has presented, the Southwest stuff. There's the CAP reports, Campaign Against Arms Trades report, which have looked at further arms conversion of the level. If you look at a nationwide level, the Campaign Against Arms Trade report points to about another 100,000 jobs being transferred from the military sector to the renewable sector, particularly marine and offshore wind, marine energy and offshore wind. If we continue going along this path, if we have high renewable energy targets and high climate change emissions reduction targets. So there is potential, is really there for a change as big as we've already seen, although people don't seem to have noticed that the change that we've had, at least the sort of arms conversion that's happened. And although some of these jobs, there's a whole debate around, and some of the other sessions are talking about this, about sort of high-tech jobs and what is socially useful transition and what is just transition, and some of the companies involved in the renewable sector are big corporations which may not have the best industrial record. But within that, you've still got a lot of potential for things like community renewables and home energy conservation programs, which are not getting nearly enough funding. And SGR is based in an eco-development near Lancaster. Our sector, our development has 40 cutting-edge passive house homes, so their energy bills are about 85% reduction from a conventional house. Also, all our energy comes from community renewables, hydro, wind, hydro, solar, and biomass. So there are lots of these projects around the country, and we need to promote these more, because these are models that can be reproduced on a much wider scale. There are lots of energy co-ops that can be supported more as well. And a couple of other points I wanted to make. One is, we talked this morning a bit about national energy, national and industrial plans, and you need government to lead the transition. I think, I mean, that in some ways you're right, and one of the examples is in Germany there are a number of transition projects on the ground that you can point to where when you've had sympathy from the government, trade unions, and at the factory level, you've seen arms convergence at a factory level. So you've got, for example, MAK, a tank manufacturer in Kiel, converting from manufacturing tanks to manufacturing train locomotives. You've got Airbus helicopters in Dannewerf, which moved from 100% military production to 80% civilian production. You've got those sorts of examples that we can use from Germany and we need to sing the successes from countries which do have transition or are much more sympathetic to arms conversion when we're arguing this case. But also the fact that actually Britain has undergone an arms conversion of its own, and we need to talk about that more. And then one thing we really lack in the UK, and there must be the data out there, and I haven't yet seen it pulled together, is if you've had a reduction of 250,000 jobs in the military-industrial sector and a rise of 100,000 jobs in the renewable energy sector, there must be regions, towns, cities where some of this transition is identifiable, and that's the data I haven't managed to find yet, and I would be really interested in if anybody has found that data, because those are the case studies we need to be using to explain to trade unionists and other skeptics that that transition can and does occur if, and sometimes without an overarching national industrial plan. So I think I'll stop there. Yeah.